Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined once again by Aidan Dodson, who is our go-to Egyptologist when it comes to Egyptian history. And I think this is the maybe fourth, possibly fifth time you've been on here now. I don't honestly, I think you've been on quite a few times because last time I think we talked about misconceptions about ancient Egypt. It was on the second episode, very second episode of this
Yes.
podcast as well, and we talked about how much we actually know about the Egyptian pharaohs as well. So those episodes you should absolutely check out as well. But this week we are going to talk about the 25th dynasty of Egypt, the Nubian Pharaohs, which is a recent biography book that you've written, which I'm of course holding up here, and it's a really lovely, great book. Now let's begin with. I want to begin with the end of the 24th dynasty and talk about a little bit about how the 24th dynasty before we go into the Nubian Pharaohs.
Yeah. Well, actually, the 24th dynasty doesn't actually precede the 25th. This is a period of time where things are somewhat complicated. Actually, we need to actually go back possibly to the latter part of the 22nd dynasty to actually sort of explain how we get to where we actually are there. Because about halfway through the 22nd dynasty, sometime in the 9th century BC, the country starts to fall apart. Initially, the southern part of Egypt around Thebes, modern Luxor, becomes a kingdom in its own right and then starts having its own civil wars. And then the northern part of Egypt starts to break up as well. So although we still have the main royal line, the 22nd dynasty, which had been ruling Egypt since the middle of the 10th century BC, it's now increasingly restricted to just being a local rulers in the northeast of Egypt, while the rest of the Nile Valley splits up. So we have a number of people claiming to be pharaoh. We also have various local governors, local mayors, and all kinds of things. And so by the time we're getting to the beginning of the 8th century, Egypt is made up of a number of fragments, each of which has got its own ruler. Some calling themselves a pharaoh, some calling themselves other things. Now, in the meantime, in the far south, in what is modern Sudan, in what we call culturally Upper Nubia, a new state had been coming into existence since sometime probably during the 11th century BC. Up until the 11th century, Egypt had been ruling Upper Nubia for some centuries. But then, with the economic and political collapse of Egypt, Nubia becomes a separate entity. Now, we don't know in much detail about what was going on during this period initially, but by the time we get to the beginning of the 8th century BC, we find a new state has come into existence, anciently called Kush, which was created along very similar lines to the Egyptian monarchy, probably because the Nubians had been under Egyptian colonial rule for a number of centuries, and therefore when they actually become an independent entity again, they model themselves on Egypt. Very much like if you look at various sort of post-imperial powers in form which beyond the British Empire, many of them have got a governmental structure very similar to that of the UK. So that's what they do, and then their power increases while everything else in the north, in Egypt proper, is starting to fall apart. And what then happens is that the Nubian kings expand out of their home territory to take over southern Egypt as well. And so by the time we get to a king called Pie or Pianchi, we're not quite sure how we pronounce his name. I'll call him Pianchi today just for convenience. He becomes a ruler of not only Nubia, Kush, but also southern Egypt. Then, in parallel with this happening, a civil war breaks out in the north of Egypt, with some of these various local kings trying to take over another local king's kingdom. But the king they pick on in the north a man called Pefchau Awibast, is an ally of the Nubians. And so Pianki comes to his rescue and effectively then conquers the rest of Egypt. However, he doesn't at this point take over as the ruler of the whole of Egypt. He simply gets all the various local rulers to swear an oath of sort of allegiance to him, but then he goes back to the south again. It's only his successor, Shabbataka, who then decides to take over Egypt properly. And Shabbataka is effectively the first full-scale king, Nubian king of Egypt. And he, in taking power, mainly simply continues to be the overlord of these various local rulers. However, one group of local rulers who he actually defeats is the 24th dynasty you've already talked about. The 24th dynasty is what the later historian Manetho labelled a group of kings who are ruling in northwestern Egypt around the city of Sais, and often called the Saite kings, they're called. And these seem to have been the one group of kings who really were resistant to Nubian overlordship. And so what Shabbataka does is he defeats the 24th dynasty in the person of its last king, Bakenrenef, who, according to later tradition, he then burns alive. But then Shabbataka and his immediate successors then become the overlords of Egypt, and effectively they are the pharaohs of Egypt. Although it's very interesting is they don't actually get rid of all the other local kings. So there are still other mini pharaohs still floating around in Egypt, but they are all very clearly under the heel of the Nubians. And then the Nubians then are the rulers of Egypt through until the middle of the 7th century BC, when they run into the Assyrians. But that's okay. That's probably that's a bit of background. That's the bit of background and where the 25th fits in with the 24th.
Let us begin with the rule and how they took the takeover of Egypt, because you said there were many petty pretenders, pharaohs, as far as I understand, in Egypt. So how did the Nubians deal with that? How did they, kind of deal with? Did they just keep them as convenience, or did they just want to get rid of them slowly or quickly as they possibly could?
It's unclear really what the mechanism is. All we can tell is that the archaeological data shows these various local rulers still remain in existence. There's no data which indicates how they actually interacted with the Nubian overlords. One assumes that because the country had been fragmented for some decades, it was most convenient, and provided that, and the Nubians may have taken the view that provided these local rulers were prepared to sort of not cause trouble, they just let them be. And it's not until well after the Nubians have ceased to be the overlords that the country becomes properly united once again. I think the country got used to having this kind of fragmented system. So we have to say we have no indication as to how the Nubians kept them in check, because possibly it may have simply been that the threat of overwhelming force, or it simply may have been that everybody took the view that actually it was convenient for everybody just to do what they were doing. It's one of those frustrations, though, when we're dealing with with ancient history, or particularly ancient Egyptian history like this, is it's often very, very difficult to try and actually understand the mechanisms, because the documentation which would allow that just doesn't exist.
Could they be kind of like middlemen in a way, that they paid higher taxes and tributes to the Nubian pharaohs?
We honestly just don't know. The very fact that under Pianki he sort of took oaths of allegiance from the various local rulers, and then went back to Nubia, might suggest that Shabbataka did the same kind of thing. That they'd sworn to do that he was the boss, and that they sort of carried on with that. We only seem to find them sort of disagreeing with that position later on in the 7th century when the Assyrians invade Egypt, and the various local rulers fairly rapidly jump ship to be loyal to the Assyrians, which suggests that they weren't particularly happy about having a Nubian overlord, but they lived with it effectively. And it's also worthwhile bearing in mind in this that the Egyptians had taken a very negative view of the Nubians going back for thousands of years. Kush, the ancient name for Nubia, was often described as vile in Egyptian texts, and for most of history, the Egyptians had been either a colonial power, or at least had been extracting resources from Nubia, really without Nubia's agreement. And actually, there was a period where the Nubians do attempt to invade Egypt during the 16th century BC. So they'd always been a negative thing. And I think I'm sure there were people during the time when the Nubians were the rulers of Egypt, the 25th dynasty, who resented that fact. There was probably a racist and post-colonialist view that these people were not fit to be their rulers, but they were. And I think that, and probably it was simply the pragmatism and lack of resource to actually do anything about them, which results in the acquiescence. And it's quite interesting that when they do throw their lot in with the Assyrians, when the Assyrians invade, they suddenly discover that the Assyrians are probably worse than the Nubians, and then go back to the Nubians. So these various local rulers, they're probably not happy with not being completely independent, but they've got to live with it.
It's kind of ironic, though, that the one that being ruled are suddenly the one that rules over the one that ruled them before.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And those kinds of reversals of history make things quite interesting. And in fact, most of these local rulers were actually of Libyan background, and the 22nd dynasty of pharaohs was actually of Libyan origin. And the Libyans had also long been regarded as being sort of regarded negatively by the Egyptians. So there's about 2 or 3 centuries of Egyptian history where the actual kings are from an ethnic group other than the Egyptians. And particularly then they're from ethnic groups who the Egyptians didn't used to like particularly. So there was clearly there was some very interesting dynamics. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the material which survives, we can't understand what the ordinary Egyptian in the street, should we say, actually thought about having a pharaoh who was a Libyan or a Nubian. It's just it's a fascinating period, but there's just so much we wish we knew about, but we don't, simply because the material just doesn't survive. The written material doesn't survive to allow us to get at that kind of level of detail, which we, of course, as historians, we'd love to have.
I want to talk a little bit about the capital of Nubian Egypt, because as in the capital of Nubia, where, of course, sorry if I said the name wrong, Meroe. But let's talk a little bit why did they keep Meroe? So I'm sorry if I say the name wrong
and
here.
Actually, Meroe isn't the capital of the Nubian pharaohs when they're ruling in Egypt. Meroe
So
becomes
how come they don't choose to stay in Meroe?
No. Meroe, although it existed, was not the capital of the Nubians until centuries after they'd left Egypt. Now, the capital during the time when the Nubians were ruling Egypt, and also during the period where they're building up into this new kingdom which takes over Egypt, their capital is a place called Napata, which is much further north than Meroe, which is very deep in modern Sudan. We don't actually know precisely where Napata is, or we know that it's very near a place called Jebel Barkal, which was the religious centre for Upper Nubia, and it's quite clear it's very close to it. It's possible that Napata is the site we now know as Sanam, which is on the opposite side of the river from Jebel Barkal, but we can't be sure. Napata is mentioned in lots and lots of texts. We know it has to be within sort of a dozen sort of square kilometres of where it is, but we can't be absolutely certain we've actually excavated it. My own view is probably Sanam is the likely location for it, but it's somewhere around there. And it's a city which seems to have been established by the Egyptians during the Egyptian imperial period. So it looks as though Napata was established as the Egyptian colonial capital probably somewhere around 1500 or 1450 BC, which is the earliest time we have any mentions of it. And also we've got material from the Jebel Barkal temples, which again kicks off in sort of it's mid 15th century, shall we say. And from that point onwards, it remains a religious capital of Nubia for hundreds and hundreds of years, possibly even down to the very end of Kushite culture in about 350 AD. It then the city of Napata then continues as that's the capital through until I think it's sort of the 5th or 6th century BC.
Excuse me.
When the capital moves down to Meroe, but still Napata is an important place.
Let's talk a little bit about the Nubian government and how the Nubians would govern the newly acquired territories and how governmental system works.
Basically, the Nubians continue how things had been done for centuries. They'd modelled their own state on pharaonic Egypt, and therefore the new sort of united kingdom of Kush and Egypt was ruled along the same manner. Now, the king remains the absolute, the senior political figure. He remains the senior religious figure, and below him you've got the standards of hierarchy. So there will be a civil government headed by the vizier or prime minister, and then you've also got the major temples under their high priests and administrators and stuff like that. So the basic running of the system, is really, you can't really detect any change from the situation going back to the earliest times. The one place where we can see a bit more detail is in Thebes, which has whose running is very much in the hands of the people who were formerly the priesthood. But there's an interesting in that case, and there's also a royal representative at Thebes in the person of the god's wife of Amun. The god's wife ship had existed for centuries as being almost the female counterpoint to the male high priest. But her status increases very significantly under the Nubians, and she seems almost to be the king's personal representative in Thebes, because she's normally the eldest daughter of the pharaoh. And in fact, the whole part of the takeover of Thebes by the Nubians in the first sort of stage of the Nubians getting control of Egypt, part of the process of that is getting a Nubian princess adopted by the current god's wife of Amun, because the succession to god's wife is by adoption. They get the current god's wife to adopt a Nubian princess, and then she carries on and then we have a further succession of those. So that's the one sort of innovation that we're aware of, but I'm sure there may well have been others. And as we've already said, exactly how the Nubian central government dealt with the various local rulers, the local many pharaohs and so on, is something we just don't know. We'd love to know, but as I say, we don't.
What about religion? What are any new? Because sometimes when you get new dynasties, not just in Egypt but in generally somewhere. For example, you have when the Mughals entered India, they imposed Islamic, for example. But religion. But was there any Kushite religion or that were brought in to Egypt, or did they keep the traditional religion that already were there?
The Nubians had basically adopted Egyptian religion during the imperial period. There are some variations, though, in the sense that although the chief god of the Nubians was Amun, very much like Amun was also the chief god in Egypt, he was a slightly different form of Amun. In Egypt, Amun is normally shown as a human being with plumes on his head. In Nubia, he's shown with the head of a ram. Now we get a ram-headed version of Amun in Egypt, but it's not the standard iconography. Whereas in Nubia, it's turned the other way round. In the standard iconography is the ram head, with the human-headed one more rarely found. But and there are certain other Nubian deities, but most of them had actually long since been assimilated into the Egyptian pantheon, because some of these Nubian deities had come into Egypt during the imperial era. So actually, although there are certain subtle differences between the gods in Nubia in Egypt, they're basically the same bunch of individuals, just with certain iconographic and probably sort of theological differences. So, and in fact, in many ways, it's always the Nubian kings always emphasize that they are working for Amun. But Amun still remains the big thing. So I don't think there's any sort of significant religious aspect to that. It is worthwhile noting that in the running of it, the Nubian pharaohs do distinguish between their role as kings of Kush and of Egypt, and that's shown in their regalia, because normally an Egyptian king will have a single cobra on the brow of the crown. The Nubians wear two. And although we don't have this spelt out anywhere in any surviving texts, it's pretty clear that one of these cobras is for Egypt, and the other cobra is for Nubia. So it looks very much like they haven't actually merged Egypt and Nubia into a single kingdom. What you've got is a dual kingdom with the same king in charge of both. In a similar kind of way that, let's say, during the latter part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had an emperor of Austria and a king of Hungary who were the same person. Similarly, in the late 19th century, you had the same person was king of Sweden and king of Norway. And in fact, almost you can always look at the same today. When King Charles is both king of the United Kingdom, he's also king of Jamaica, he's king of Australia, and all those other things. And there's a clear distinction between those various sort of roles. And I think that's what we see during the time of the rule there, is that they haven't merged the two kingdoms. You've simply got the same man who is in charge of both.
Let's talk a little bit about the architecture under Nubian rule, and let's talk about, does it change anything if there are distinct architectural types we see at least especially in the medieval era, especially in the Islamic world, when you see, for example, different architectural type from the dynasties and empires. Is there difference from the Libyan dynasty and the Nubian in the architecture and construction work?
Generally speaking, there is no difference architecturally. Again, because the Nubians had been colonized by the Egyptians, they basically picked all that up. There are some changes which we see in architecture around this period, but whether they're anything to do with the fact that the Nubians have come in, or simply that it's part of the evolution of architecture in general. Part of the issue in actually detecting anything is that during the sort of chaos of the years prior to the Nubian takeover, very little monumental building had taken place. So actually, we've got not really very much to actually judge by. And also, actually, most of the stuff which was built during the Nubian period is so badly ruined that we can't necessarily get much out of it. But there's nothing to indicate any kind of radical change at all. there's always evolution in architecture over time. But I don't think there's anything which any of the differences we can see between New Kingdom architecture and Nubian period architecture. There's nothing which is significant, other than possibly that architects have been sort of playing around with some ideas to some degree. But beyond that, no.
What about
The only one thing I would sort of add
Pardon?
is that for their burials, the Nubian kings adopt pyramids, which have been given up by pharaohs centuries earlier. That's the one area where you can actually pick up something which is distinctly different. Actually, and also another couple of things, just again, it's in the detail, is that going back to what you were saying about gods, gods who are minor deities in Egypt may actually be shown in much larger scale in Nubia. But it's all in the margins anyway.
So let's talk a little bit about international relations in the Nubian dynasty. And you mentioned Assyria. Let's talk earlier. So let's talk a little bit about Syrian relations, but also about other kingdoms and empires that may occur under this time period. So let's talk a little bit about how international relations worked. So,
yeah. Well, the rise of the Nubian pharaohs really coincides with the major expansion of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians, which is basically modern northern Iraq, is where they kick off from. They had been one of the great powers of the Middle East for a long time. But during the period of the Nubians, the Assyrians had expanded their power, and effectively they were the only other substantive power in the world. They had absorbed Babylon, they had taken over most of Syria, Palestine, and so really they were the only foreign power really worth talking about. Of course, by being an empire, there were various problems they were having with people who didn't want to be part of their empire, particularly in Syria, Palestine. And the international relations of the Nubian pharaohs is really where they start getting involved with with what's going on in Palestine. Up until the Nubians had arrived, or at least up until the time of Shabbataka, anyway.
there's always something going on down in Palestine, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's always been, yeah. And basically, up until that point, relationships with foreign rulers, shall we say, had been carried out by the 22nd dynasty, who had been the national pharaohs. By the time we're talking about, they're only the rulers of the northeastern part of Egypt. However, because they are in the northeastern part of Egypt, they're the ones who have to deal with foreign affairs effectively. And we do know that one of their kings, Azorkon IV, ended up having to give the Assyrians a whole load of horses at one point, which suggests that he was sort of buying them off when they were threatening an invasion. Then the Nubians take over properly, and therefore Shabbataka and his successors then become the people who are dealing with foreign affairs. Actually, much of the head-scratching of the Assyrians, because when they suddenly find that they're dealing with these Nubians now, rather than the Egyptians they had been previously been used to dealing with, the Assyrians sort of don't really know what to make of them, because there is a text saying, well, who are these people, effectively? No, nobody's ever visited them. They've never sent gifts to Assyrian kings. So who are these people? So there's a bit that they're sort of very much the new kids on the block here. And initially it seems that they play it quite safe with the Assyrians, because late in the reign of Shabbataka, there's a Palestinian prince, who attempts to revolt against the Assyrians, fails, and flees to Egypt. But then the Egyptians agree to, or at least the Nubians, on behalf of the Egyptians, agree to extradite this prince back to Assyria. So it looks as though initially the idea is not to sort of stir the Assyrians up, to appease them, so to use the terminology from the 1930s. But then Shabbataka dies, and his successor, Shabaka, takes a rather different approach. There
If I
seems to be a number.
may intrude you for a second, let's talk about Shabaka and Shabbat. So forgive me if I say the name again. Forgive me if I say the name wrong. But as you mentioned in your book, this is perhaps one of the more controversial bits about the Egyptian history, because there is quite a bit of confusion between Shabbataka and Shabbata. Sorry if I say his name wrong, but let's talk a little bit about the confusion between the two
Okay.
rulers.
Right. Okay. Well, we've always known that there was a Shabaka and a Shabbataka. There's no question about the two kings' existences. However, there was nothing until fairly recently which proved which way round they went. Now, if you go back to the Greek writing historian Manetho, who was writing in the 3rd century BC, he starts off his 25th dynasty with a Sabakon and a Sabako. And it's quite clear that this is simply a Greek writing of those two names. But the question as to which one was which wasn't clear. And back in the 200 years ago, almost exactly, the early Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion, who had been responsible for deciphering hieroglyphs, simply made the assumption that the correct order was Shabaka, then Shabbataka. And although a couple of his contemporaries sort of questioned that, by the time we're into the mid-19th century, everybody had simply assumed that Shabaka was followed by Shabbataka. Not say for any deep reason. Possibly it may even have been the fact there was an additional that Shabbataka seems a slightly longer version, longer name, so he might be the later one. But anyway, that was the assumption right the way through to the early 21st century. Nobody had ever tested it, but it seemed to work with the data available. The problem then came was as the 20th century went on, having those kings in that order started providing some problems, various little details of history. And then the big thing came in late 1990s, when an inscription was discovered in Iran, a place called Tangivar. And this inscription was by Sargon II, who was a king of Assyria. And it mentioned Shabbataka. And because we know what the events of the time are, that mention of Shabbataka can be dated precisely to 706 BC. And this is actually to do with the extradition of this Palestinian king. The trouble was that 706 was not a date which worked very well for Shabbataka if you assumed that he came after Shabaka. And then for a short while, there were some elaborate attempts to try and save this. But the ripple effects of knowing that Shabbataka was alive in 706 meant that it was messing up a whole lot of history. You're having to make all sorts of weird assumptions to try and keep that. And then then early in the 20th and 21st centuries, one Egyptologist said, well, hang on a second. What happens if we swap Shabbataka and Shabaka around? That problem disappears with Shabbataka, the earlier of the two kings. 706 is fine for him. And also it turned out that by swapping them round, not only did that problem go, but some of the other problems which had been brewing up during the later part of the 20th century as more data was coming in, and it was all. So suddenly it looked, if you swap them round, then people say, well, why did we have them round that way in the first place? And it turned out, because Champollion sort of guessed it was that way 200 years ago. And Egyptology is normally quite a slow-moving discipline, and a radical idea takes quite a long time to bed in. But actually, the swapping round of Shabaka and Shabbataka was accepted almost instantaneously by everybody who works on that particular period of history. there's a couple of people who were slightly still
What
skeptical.
what made it so acceptable? That's this sudden change that over 200 years people accepted this. Not that
It was,
Shabata were before Shabbataka, and then now suddenly, oh, this is proven wrong. What made the accept? What made it so
it was
acceptable?
simple. It was simply that it solved all problems. That actually, when you swap them round, suddenly every single problem about the period evaporated. And the very fact it solved everything was the thing which really sort of got, I think, the specialists to fall in line, because there was nothing, there was no result of it which was caused a new problem. It solved everything. And then when you started realizing that the whole original order was simply guesswork by Champollion back 200 years ago, it was all. But it was quite remarkable, as I think sort of 95% of people, of the specialists who work on that period. Admittedly, it's not a huge number of us who do work on that period, but we all said, yeah, that's fine. So it was an interesting example of how within a few years Egyptian history can change. The problem is, of course, there's every book which has been written before about 2005 or 2010, which states categorically that Shabaka preceded Shabbataka. And I was recently, and I've just been actually looking at a draft of a book by a friend of mine who is mentioning this period. He's not a specialist in that period. It's me, he's mentioning it in context of a different topic. And I've had decided to correct him and say, no, it is the other way around. And it's going to take a long time for that to come through, because so many of the standard books have that in. And even among Egyptologists, unless you're actually one of the specialists in that particular period, you're not necessarily going to understand why this has happened.
And we
So
spoke of
it's
this.
going to be a lot. It's going to be a long time before it. But I think that from the point of view of those of us who actually work on the period, we are now pretty absolutely certain that it is that Shabbataka comes before Shabaka.
And we spoke about this before we started recording. That kind of is the problem with Egyptology. You don't. It's such a minefield that things can also almost change overnight with one archaeological evidence that comes through. So it's it kind of is a bit minefield.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And so particularly, it's bad enough when you're dealing with the people, fellow specialists, but when you're looking at the broad, the wider world, the very idea that what seems to have been an undoubted fact isn't a fact after all, is it really sort of blows some people's minds. And it's a concept I think I probably mentioned when I previously spoke to you. I've got this. I have this concept of zombie history, whereby you've got something which was acceptable history even 10 years ago, 100 years ago, and as such has passed into the broader discourse. It's passed into popular books. It's passed into TV programs, all those kind of things, and therefore has taken on an existence of its own. Yet, from the point of view of a scholar who is dealing with the period, the idea is completely dead. Hence
It's
the
sort of
reason a
like the
zombie.
Night of a Star reaching the one we see is already dead, but it's by the time it reaches us.
It is no longer something which people who actually specialise in the period would even entertain as a possibility. Yet it's still out there. So it's what you're going to be. It's what, say, popular books, books by people working in other disciplines of archaeology, who are simply sort of lifting stuff and haven't understood the detail. No tour guides, the whole thing. So it's going to be a long while before that gets in. And I think the book which we're talking about today, my book, is one of the first sort of books of its kind to actually actually tell the history on the basis of this reordering. In fact, it's showing again how things can be changed. I wrote the book I wrote about 10 years ago, which includes this period. but that was written before the reordering. And then when I had to do a reprint of it, I had to completely rewrite the second half of the book for the reprint because of that change. Because it's not just simply the two swap round. There's also ripple effects of that as well across history. So it does make. But on the other hand, it's what makes one of the reasons why what I like about Egyptian history is the very fact that one can literally change history by one's work. Not in quite the same sort of way that historians working in sort of later periods, they can still make a difference, but you can't sort of make such a fundamental change as that.
So let's talk a little bit about the fall of the 25th dynasty and how the Nubian rule came to an end and the successor of the Nubian Pharaos.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this actually picks up where we left off when we were talking about foreign policy, because say initially the Nubians seem to have taken a very cautious approach to dealing with the Assyrians, who were this sort of superpower of embracing what is now modern Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and even parts of Iran they were controlling. But then Shabaka takes a rather more different approach. Because
if I may interrupt you again, was this the Neo-Assyrian or is it the first Assyrian?
This is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the last phase of the Assyrian Empire. Yeah. But what seems to have happened is that the various local rulers in Palestine who'd been trying to revolt against them kept on asking the Nubians for help, which they seem initially to have said no to, again because they're trying to keep out of all of this. It's almost a bit like isolationism, effectively. However, eventually an army is sent into Palestine, and it seems to be to help in preventing Jerusalem being taken by the Assyrians in 701 BC. So they get involved. Whether there has also been suggestions that that the result of this, the Assyrians and the Nubians come to some kind of agreement that the Assyrians will keep out, will not interfere with Egypt and vice versa. And the negative evidence for this is that there's no attempt by the Assyrians to attack the Egyptians for the next 20 odd years, or no more. That's getting on for 30 years. So there's some kind of modus vivendi seems to have been reached. However, then, probably as a result of getting a new king arriving in Assyria, the Assyrians then decide to add Egypt to their empire as well, because Egypt is the one bit of known world they don't control. So then we have, because by this time we've got a new king in Egypt and Nubia, Taharqa, and during the last years of his reign, we have a series of Assyrian invasions, the first of which he manages to repulse, but then he's driven out of Egypt back into Nubia by the next invasion. He then tries to make a comeback. There's a series of Assyrian invasions take place, during which time the local rulers in Egypt rather flip-flop between the Assyrians and the Nubians. They clearly don't like either of them, but they've got to. They need to. The only local ruler in Egypt who stays loyal to the Assyrians once they've arrived is a king called Nekhau and his son Samtik, and they are rulers of what we refer to as the 26th dynasty. And in fact, they are actually the heirs to the kings of the 24th dynasty, who were the one set of local rulers the Nubians had got rid of at the outset. I remember talking about burning back in Renef alive. Now, the royal line had reasserted itself subsequently, and now with the Assyrians here, they make it quite clear they prefer the Assyrians to the Egyptians, probably with a view that the Assyrians are more likely to be able to make them the kings of the whole of Egypt. Now, initially, it doesn't necessarily fully work out for them, because it's another Nubian comeback, as a result of which Nekhau is executed by the Nubians. But then the Assyrians come back yet again, and with them come into Egypt comes Nekhau's heir Psamtik I. And as a result of that invasion, the Nubians are effectively driven out of Egypt, except for Thebes. And Psamtik becomes the king of northern Egypt, pretty well without rivals, because it looks very much like the Assyrians, who ended up getting fed up with the other local rulers and executed them because they'd been flip-flopping so much. So probably Psamtik benefited from the fact that all the other mini pharaohs and whatever have been executed by the Assyrians. And at this point, then, the Assyrians leave Egypt because they've got problems back at home. And in fact, the Assyrian Empire has only a few years left to exist, leaving Psamtik nominally a vassal of the Assyrians, but effectively the independent ruler of northern Egypt. And then over the next few years, he manages to then expand his power, gets rid of any other little local rulers left, and finally, about 9 years after he's taken control of northern Egypt, he also takes control of Nubia. It looks as though of Thebes. Nubia remains an entity in its own right, but the southern part of Egypt is then absorbed into Psamtik's kingdom. So therefore, by the middle of the 7th century BC, Egypt is reunited. It's no longer any little local kings. There's a single kingdom, the 26th dynasty under Psamtik I. The Nubians have now withdrawn back into Nubia itself, where their kingdom then continues on until 350 AD. There are certain points whereby the Nubian kings have interactions with the rulers of Egypt in Lower Nubia, the southern part of Egypt, before you get into Sudan proper. But from here on inwards, they no longer sort of covet rule of Egypt. So the key point is the Assyrian invasions, which then facilitate the ability of Psamtik I to become an undisputed king of Egypt.
How would you say the overall rule of the Nubian dynasty? Would you say they were tyrants? Would you say they were decent rulers? Would you say they were good rulers, or were they a little bit of all this stuff?
Yeah. The answer is we don't know, because we've not got the data. Clearly, they were not necessarily liked, given what the local rulers did when the Assyrians turned up. But they certainly, the fact they glued the country back together again meant that it was certainly a lot more prosperous. It's difficult to judge these sort of things without sort of budgets and things available. But a good way of measuring that is how much building work is being carried out by the state. And in the period for the couple of hundred years prior to the Nubians taking over Egypt, we have very, very little evidence of any kind of monumental building. But then once the Nubians are in control, we get quite a lot of major building work being found at Memphis, at Thebes, and the principal sites in Egypt. Also, private individuals who really started building monumental tombs again. Again, in that interim period, a couple of hundred years prior to that, we have virtually nothing in the way of monumental tombs. We just have a few shafts with coffins in them, but nothing spectacular. So the very fact that both royal and private building is much more significant during the time that the Nubians are in power does suggest that however they sort of managed things, certainly their advent had brought prosperity to the country. Also, what might have also helped was the fact that part of the key to the prosperity of the country was the availability of gold. And possibly one of the reasons for the decline of Egypt between the 11th and 8th centuries was the fact that gold, which had previously been acquired from Nubia was no longer available to them. Of course, the Nubians themselves controlled the gold supply from Nubia, and therefore they were able to use that gold to spend in their role as kings of Egypt as well. So whether or not they were good, however you define good or bad rulers, they seem to have been effective rulers, keeping the country together, keeping it prosperous. So, yeah, from what we can tell, they were a positive influence during the time that they were ruling in Egypt.
How have they been viewed generally in history by historians and by earlier historians? Has there been racial assumptions about the Nubians, or have there been a bit controversial about when it comes to race and things like this by earlier 19th, 18th, or 20th century historians?
Yeah. The answer is very much yes. That has been a very regrettable feature of historiography. And it's really quite noticeable because when the 25th dynasty was first identified, it was not recognized that these were black Africans who comprised them. And up until the middle of the 19th century, even the last of the quarter of the 19th century, normally sort of histories were normally quite complimentary about them. And then when it becomes quite clear that these people are actually black Africans, then assessments become much more negative without any new evidence. And there you find very distinctly, blatantly racist statements about them. And what's very interesting about that is even when the overt racism begins to sort of to lessen as we move into the later part of the 20th century, many of those negative assessments about them continue, even though they are no longer on the basis of racist rhetoric. And what's quite interesting here is that it indicates a lack of awareness, historiographical awareness, by a lot of late 20th century Egyptologists. They seem to have simply taken these things without actually following back the traces of where these ideas came from. And I think this is the reason why it's so important for, as historians, as Egyptologists, for us to fully understand where our ideas come from. And in my book, there's an extensive chapter which examines all this thinking. And I think some of these sort of negative assessments are being made. People have got no idea, at least hopefully they've got no idea anyway, that these assessments were based on somebody's racial prejudice, decades earlier on. But I think emphasize, and then actually when you look at the actual data, you realise that the positive assessments from the early 19th century are fully borne out by that data. And that sort of all these various sort of accusations of incompetence and other things, which are quite an important part, even the standard works of the latter part of the 20th century, they all come back to. But it does seem that these people didn't actually realise all they're doing is parroting something which somebody else said, without fully understanding why that idea came about. And I think it's so important for historians to understand where the ideas which they're currently living with come from.
And to do another comparison with this, kind of see this with Eastern Roman Empire as well, where previously historians kind of didn't really care for Eastern Roman history and they call them lazy Greeks and etc. But now, recently, historians have kind of started to realize that, hey, that's not the case. They are actually quite fascinating and influential. So it's kind of similar. You see parallels there as well, if that's a good comparison. But has there been other dynasties that has similar treatment because of the racial treatment of being black pharaohs or being colored pharaohs that have has this negative assessment? And that's not necessarily because today, but as you mentioned, that is there other dynasties as well that should really been reevaluated and taken a new approach that as you do in your book in this way.
Not really, because the Nubian Pharaohs are the only ones who've stood out really as being racially other compared with the Egyptians. The Egyptians have always sort of been almost, although of course they are Africans, have always been sort of made honorary Europeans by scholarship throughout. Um, it's only the Nubians who are very clearly not, very clearly other racially, have been the ones who've been sort of picked on from this point of view. Of course, there's sort of another side to that coin, is that there have been a sort of attempts to make the Egyptians more African by some trends of modern scholarship trying to to look at Afrocentrism and things like that, which have almost had the equal and opposite kinds of effects on here. And I think the bottom line, it really is that when we're looking at some of this recent stuff to do with sort of trying to probably make the Egyptians more African than they probably are, can be seen to be, and these racist attacks on the Nubians indicates really that that's a bigger thing, that actually that the sort of our racial labelling, which we find in the West, and particularly actually in the States, where there's a whole sort of the whole racial politics is something very different from what we find in Europe. Is that the categories which we use in modern politics and modern racial politics simply don't exist in the ancient world. There is certainly no evidence for any of the texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt, or wherever, whereby skin color was a thing. It was more to do with your social, political, cultural kinds of aspects that mattered. They recognised different people, but it wasn't necessarily that anything to do with your. It was a question of what culturally you were, which made the fundamental difference.
I do believe that it's an old book, to be fair, but Chancellor Williams, I believe, write about the Nubian Pharaohs a little bit about this issue when he writes in his the destruction of African civilization. If I remember the title book correctly, but I do believe Chancellor Williams touches upon this issue in his book. Actually, I think this was written in early 80s, late 70s, in the 80s, so it's quite an old book, but it actually do touches upon this problem in the.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that there's a danger of going any other direction, and the books you were talking about there, they're sort of idealizing the Nubian Pharaohs as sort of as part of a broader African civilization. I think the very concept of a single African civilization is a very dangerous one, any more than we can talk about a single, civilization within any other continent. There's a vast differences in so on. But the very fact that the Nubian Pharaohs were much more darker skinned than the Egyptians. Let's try and be as sort of neutral in this as possible. Has been used to make them the answers of all kinds of things, simply because they are the Black Africans we can actually trace in ancient history. And then when you've only got and they're sort of then picked up as being an archetype for the whole continent, and that just becomes that's as historically illiterate as sort of as other views in any other direction. Therefore, this does actually bring in a completely further aspect of the study of the Nubian Pharaohs, well beyond anything to do with what we can actually say about them historically, because they've taken on a whole new life in the 19th and 20th centuries as well. And I think that's again an interesting facet of dealing with ancient history, particularly ancient Egyptian history, is that there is what you might call mainstream history, which is scholars who are trying to use the actual contemporary data to work out what was happening in the past. And then the use is made of those historical individuals in more modern times, and those uses are often without any kind of real roots in what you might call the real history. And in fact, where they do actually make some use of sort of real history, it's often some of these zombie facts I was talking about, whereby it's things which 100 years ago people were saying about which we don't think anymore. Yet those are attractive to certain people who've got
The
political
shooting
axes to
star, so to
grind
speak.
in modern times.
It's the shooting star, as I said earlier.
Oh yeah, and I think that it's not just in you, but there's other as well. There's a whole sort of new, it's a whole new Egypt and Nubia in existence, which bears no resemblance to the real one, which is growing in sort of the alternative in alternative areas. Conspiracy theorists, weird and wonderful websites, books, and so on. There's a whole world out there, which it's really quite a scary one in a way, because
It
as
must be
somebody who
frustrating for you as an Egyptologist.
oh yeah, and yeah, absolutely, and when you're engaging with sort of amateurs and sort of people out in the street effectively, often this stuff gets thrown at you, and sort of how do you deal with it? The only upside I can see to it is the fact it does actually get people interested in this stuff. And when they are prepared to engage with Egyptologists and sort of mainstream historians, it's possible one can sort of bring them into the fold. The trouble is, though, there are people who there's also a stream of all this which regards the mainstream archaeology, Egyptology, history as being sort of self-seeking and sort of hiding the truth from the world and all those that also rhetoric. So
Like how
there's
aliens built the pyramids, we all know that's a fact.
all that kind of stuff. All that kind of stuff.
Where are you hiding those papers?
Yeah, and these people make money out of it as well. Which is what's really frustrating, is that as the mainstreamers make a pittance, while being accused of sort of hiding the fact exactly why we should be hiding all this all this cool stuff. If it were true, is something I've always found difficult. While the people who are attacking us are raking in the money, and having sort of TV series and things, which my side of the house never gets a chance to do.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming back. You're always welcome back to the podcast. Of course, before you go, we are recording this on the 24th of October, and of course it will be late November by the time this episode is released. But you have a naval book out, I believe, that came out on today of recordings.
Yeah. It's actually as some people are aware, I have a sort of double academic life, both as a professor of Egyptology, but I'm also research on modern naval history. And normally I've got 2 books on the go at once. And in fact, I've got 2 which are due out in the next few months. One of which came out today, which is on the Hawkins class cruisers of the British Royal Navy, which served between 1919 and 1945. And then my other one, which is due out in January, is on the pharaohs Thutmose III and Hatshepsut. And they might like me to come and talk about Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, perhaps.
Absolutely.
In the new year.
And of course, where can people find this book that we discussed in this episode? If they want to read more, which you absolutely should read, it's a brilliant book on the Nubian Pharaohs. So where can people find the book if they want to read more? And do you have any social media where if people have further questions about Egyptology or Nubian of the 25th dynasty or anything else regarding ancient Egypt conspiracies or other things they might want to know?
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for talking to me.
Thank you very much again for coming back. You're always welcome back. We'll see if you can have me back again when they book on Hatshepsut. Sorry if I can't. It's a tricky name to say. But this has been what damaged well. My name is Alan. You can find us on Instagram and with that H12. You can find us on Twitter slash X and with that H12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing and leave a comment about if you have further interest in Egyptology and of course what you think about this episode. If you're on Spotify, you can also leave a comment in the episode. That would help us out a lot. Give us 5 stars as well. If you give us 1 if you hated this episode, though 5 stars would be preferable. You can leave an app review on Apple Podcasts as well, and please like. My name is Alan. This has been that H12. You should absolutely pick up his book, The Nubian Pharaos, on the 25th Dynasty of Egypt. You will learn so much more than we discussed in this episode. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I'll see you next time.